Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Jason Gaines, and I'm the chair of the Political Science Department here at the University of Louisville. I want to welcome everyone to today's event. As you all know, we are here to celebrate Dr. Ken Conca's work by honoring him with the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. Since this award was established in 1988, it's been administered by the Department of Political Science. That's why you're meeting me today, if you don't already know me. First, it was administered by Dr. Paul Weber, then for many years by Dr. Roger Payne, and since 2011, Dr. Charles Ziegler has served as the faculty director. I'm excited, as I'm sure we all are, to hear more about Dr. Conca's work. Before getting to his presentation, though, I would like to formally introduce my esteemed colleague, Dr. Charles Ziegler. As I've already mentioned, he's the current director of this award and facilitates the selection process all the way through. This is quite an onerous endeavor, given the number of submissions that we get. So I want to thank him for his tireless efforts, and I will give him a round of applause, and I'm sure everyone else is clapping too. And with that, I give you Dr. Ziegler to tell you a little bit more about the award and about Dr. Conca. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Jason. Let me tell you a little bit first about the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. As Dr. Gaines said, it was established in 1988 by a generous gift from Charles Grawemeyer, philanthropist in Louisville. The award's given to those who have taken on issues of world importance and presented viewpoints that could lead to a more just and peaceful world. Each idea supports one noble cause, and that is to inspire us all to work together for the common good. The award's presented annually to the winner of a competition designed to stimulate the recognition, dissemination, and critical analysis of outstanding proposals for improving world order. As far as we know, the Grawemeyer Award for World Order is the largest in the world at $100,000, and that is presented in full during the award ceremony, which, thanks to the pandemic, is going to be done virtually this year. As Jason said, we get a large number of very, very good submissions from the very top people in political science and international relations. And those are judged according to the originality, feasibility, and potential impact, not by the cumulative record of a nominee. All nominations then go through a lengthy and exhausting review process. Each entry that comes in, I'll send it out for peer review by two experts in the specific field who evaluate the work according to the major criteria. The Department of Political Science Grawemeyer Committee then meets generally in April and May, several times to winnow out the very top 6 to 7 books. And then we will select a distinguished international jury of the world's leading scholars and practitioners, and they spend the summer reading those works and then come to Louisville in September, deliberate for 2 days, and make their choice. However, their recommendation is reviewed and finalized by one more committee, a presidential selection committee, which consists of leading administrators at U of L and prominent representatives of the community. Mr. Grawemeyer insisted that lay people be in on the selection so that the winning work would be intelligible to the educated layperson. And this whole process takes nearly a year. It is pretty thorough. Now, let me introduce to you Dr. Ken Conca, who is the winner of the 2021 Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order for this book, An Unfinished Foundation, the United Nations and Global Environmental Governance. Dr. Conca is professor in the School of International Service at American University in Washington, D.C. His research and teaching focus on global environmental governance, environmental peace building in war-torn societies, environmental politics and policy in the United Nations system, water governance, and environmental policy analysis. His most recent books are the Oxford Handbook of Water Politics and Policy and An Unfinished Foundation, for which he won the Grawemeyer Award. He's the editor also of the widely used teaching anthology, Green Planet Blues. In addition to the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order, Dr. Conca has also won the International Studies Association's Harold and Margaret Sprout Award for Best Book on International Environmental Affairs, the Chadwick Alger Prize for Best Book in the Field of International Organization, and the Al-Momin Environmental Peacebuilding Award. He's a member of the United Nations Environment Program Advisory Group on Conflict and Peace Building. So I'm going to turn it over to him. We will have time for questions and answers afterward. If you do wish to ask a question at that time, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ken Conca. Ken?
Thank you, Chuck, for those generous remarks, and thank you, Jason. And welcome to everyone who's here with us today. I don't know whether to say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, so I'll simply say welcome to you. I'd like to start, obviously, by thanking the Grawemeyer Foundation and the committee and the University of Louisville for recognizing my work. I have to say, when I look at some of the past recipients of the award, it's gratifying and it's humbling, frankly, to be included in that list. There are some true intellectual giants on that list, and people who've really shaped my own thinking about some of the issues that I'll be talking with you today. I also appreciate that the emphasis in this award is on the power of ideas, which is something that I believe in very, very strongly. And at the outset, I'd like to thank also the many people in and around the United Nations who've helped me understand the various ways that it engages the very important environmental challenges facing the planet and its people. And make no mistake, those challenges are enormous. 2/3 of the world's fish stocks are being fished to the limit or overfished. It's estimated that 25% of the Earth's land surface, excluding the polar ice caps, 25% suffers from degraded soils. The rate of global deforestation has slowed, but the world still loses an area equivalent to the state of Kentucky, ironically, each year. Human activities load more nitrogen from fertilizers and from industrial pollution and automobile exhaust, load more nitrogen into the global nitrogen cycle than the background natural flows. We have, in essence, become the nitrogen cycle through our activities. And I haven't even mentioned climate change. And it's important to stress that these are not statistical abstractions. There are an estimated 3 million people each year that die prematurely from air pollution. There's a couple of billion people on the planet who lack safely managed drinking water, and even more, something like 2.4 billion by our best estimate, who lack a minimally adequate sanitation system. The Romans introduced an improved sanitation system to Rome in the time of Claudius 2 millennia ago. 2,000 years later, there are still 2.4 billion people on the planet who don't enjoy that basic amenity and that basic human right. It's estimated there are more than 3 billion people who live in rural areas around the planet who eke out their living from degraded soils. And the number of people who've been displaced by extreme weather events now tops 20 million people annually. So I have worked on the governance dimensions of these issues and on the political dimensions of these issues for some 3 decades now, with much of that work occurring in and on and around the United Nations. So I have had the privilege of offering expert remarks to the International Law Commission as it attempts to prepare a draft treaty for signature by UN member states on protecting the environment in the context of armed conflict. I have worked for many years in an advisory capacity, a volunteer advisory capacity with the United Nations Environment Program, specifically its branch that works on disaster and conflict, as they attempt to help war-torn societies and societies recovering from disaster to put sustainable development, good environmental governance, and smart natural resources management at the center of recovery strategies. I have conducted interviews in and on and around the UN Security Council on the way that climate change affects the activities of that body and the way that it might find a role and a voice for itself on climate issues. And I've had many dealings over the years with civil society organizations as they try to press the UN to be better and smarter on these issues. And I have to say that as I've done that work, I have come to watch the UN grow less effective over time, and in many ways increasingly marginal to the great matters and great challenges of global environmental governance. An organization that once led the fight on climate change, biodiversity loss, desertification, has frankly grown unable to create new agreements on pressing environmental issues. It's been unable to strengthen existing agreements. It is lagging badly in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals that it set for the world's nations in 2015, and was lagging even before COVID dealt such a body blow to those efforts. On climate change, it has been unable to do better than a weak and essentially voluntary agreement that falls far short of what we need. The UN does a lot of important work. I don't mean to disparage the importance of much of what gets done. And in fact, all of those statistics that I gave you at the start of the talk are sourced from UN data collection and monitoring activities, and we need that. It wasn't always this way. Back at the time of the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, many people look to that, and I agree, as sort of the high watermark for both the United Nations and for global environmental governance in general, with treaties on climate change, biodiversity, desertification, and an Agenda 21 blueprint for sustainable development into the 21st century. But 20 years later, in 2012, when the UN called member states back to Rio de Janeiro for another global summit, the situation was far different. Unable to agree on a convention for a new convention for the world's oceans, unable to agree on funding mechanisms for sustainable development or climate finance, unable to agree on several key specific elements of the Sustainable Development Goals. And in the end, kicking all of the hard questions on the table back into the UN General Assembly, as though the General Assembly were not exactly the same member states gathered in Rio and unable to agree. At the end of that summit, a watered down and rambling communique was released. And even that was only possible because of some 11th hour intervention diplomatically by the Brazilian hosts, who skillfully removed all of the contentious items from the document so that governments could agree to release it. One prominent environmental activist, when reading that final communique, simply tweeted that it was the longest suicide note in history. So one small piece of evidence indicating this decline. In the book, I try to tell the history of this and measure it in many different ways. And I won't belabor that here, but just one small bit of evidence. The figure in the upper left charts in the period following World War II, the annual rate of agreeing to international environmental treaties. And as you can see, we hit the high water mark right at the 1992 Earth Summit, and we've been in a fairly precipitous and steady decline ever since. The figure on the lower right is even more troubling in many ways, because it measures the rate of amendment and revision of the existing agreements that we have. Given the uncertainty, given the new science we're acquiring all the time, given the change in scope of the problems, it's critically important that the treaty frameworks that we create be flexible and dynamic and living and breathing and adaptive. And as you can see from these figures, we're not agreeing and we're not innovating. And that's really, really quite problematic. So as I became to see this, came to see this pattern of decline, and as I said, the UN still does much vital work on the environment. But the broad pattern is pretty clearly in the direction of declining influence and declining coherence. And as I watched this, I also came to notice a puzzling pattern about how the UN goes about engaging in the world's environmental challenges. And that's really at the heart of the work I'm talking about today and that's being recognized today. And to unravel that puzzle and see that pattern, it's worth taking just a moment to go back to the end of World War II and the UN's founding. It's fascinating to note the environment, the word environment does not appear in the UN Charter. And in some ways, that's understandable if we think about it. The delegates that gathered in San Francisco in 1945 for the final negotiations on the Charter, they didn't see the planet as the fragile and intensely interconnected system that we know it to be today. Consider the Earth had never been seen from space at that time. Many of these delegates were posted in Mexico City or in Washington or in Ottawa, and they were taking a train across this vast continental expanse of the United States to get to San Francisco and seeing this resource-rich terrain unfold before their eyes in a way that many of them had never seen it before. Um, the big wake-up call about humanity's destructive power, the use of nuclear weaponry at the end of World War II, was still several weeks away later in the summer of 1945, August, the North American summer, sorry, when they gathered. So it's no surprise they didn't see the environment as one of the great missions of the organization. What they did see as the mission of the organization was quite clear. They gave it a four-part mandate that constitute the four legs on which the UN continues to stand to this day, and is right there in the preamble to the Charter of the United Nations. Save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Address the problem of human rights, the dignity and worth of the human person. Create an international system governed not by the naked exercise of power, but by agreed upon laws and rules. And development, although another word that doesn't appear in the Charter, but clearly the spirit of what they were calling for when they talked about promoting social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. That was the basis on which the UN was founded, and it's the basis on which all of the work that it does today continues to occur. Peace and security, human rights, international law, and development. But the curious pattern that I noticed was that if you look at the way that the UN engages with environmental questions, desertification, deforestation, climate change, whatever it may be, we see lots of emphasis on two of the pillars and very little in the other two. Lots of activity in international law, treaty negotiations, and so on. Lots of activity around the theme of sustainable development. Very little on peace, very little on human rights, although there are some important exceptions, and I will in fact talk about those today. In fact, if the UN were said to have a grand strategy about global environmental governance, it would be something like better law between nations and smarter development within them. But given the four-part mandate, to engage the environment that way is a little bit like a horse trying to balance on the two left side legs underneath its body, while the two legs on the other side of its body dangle uselessly in the air, maybe touch the ground occasionally to restabilize the beast. Clearly, this is not a horse that's walking forward on a steady gait, much less galloping at the pace that we needed to move today. And I became convinced that this off-balance posture was an important part of the story of the UN's growing ineffectiveness and political irrelevance. And so when I set out to write this book, I really tackled three questions. How do we get to this point? Why is that the case? Why that unbalanced posture? Why does that matter? Why does the grand strategy not work particularly effective in the contemporary global environmental sphere? And what can we do about it? And so I won't spend too much time on that first question of how we got here, except to say it's partly a story, and this may be obvious, about the interests of powerful member states. You often hear it said that the UN can only do what member states will allow it to do. And There's some truth in that statement, of course. Sometimes it's used as an excuse, and governments will hide behind each other in inaction. But certainly there's some truth to it. But there's more to the story than just that. It's also a story of history. It's a story about the fight that was waged by newly independent former colonies when they gained political sovereignty to try to gain sovereignty over their natural resources, the plundering of which had been so central to colonialism. The UN was founded by 50 nations. Today, there are almost 200. And as we got dozens of new member states coming from Asia in the 1950s, from Africa in the 1960s, they were determined to exert full sovereign control over their natural resources as the key to their own political and economic development. And so the question of natural resources was the great struggle in the origins of the UN for the first few decades. And it was a struggle that was largely won in favor of the concept of permanent sovereignty over natural resources. Now, it's interesting that the countries that fought this battle, they saw this as a human rights issue, and they used the human rights apparatus of the UN to make it so. But it is the emphasis on the rights of states, and it pushed the question of the rights of people into the background with important consequences, as I think we'll see in a moment. So by the time we fast forward to the 1970s and the global environmental challenge bursts onto the scene with the modern environmental movement arising, the idea that nature was a sovereign affair was already deeply embedded in the DNA of the organization. The story of how it got to be this way is also partly a story about the bureaucracy of the UN and the internal workings of the organization itself. Uh, Policy entrepreneurs who knew how to read the bureaucratic incentives grew in the direction of environmental law and environment and development, and turf battles and other factors would cut off their ability to grow policy agendas in the directions of human rights or of peace. So in some ways, that history is just a story of bureaucratic politics. But it's important to note the UN is more than just an organization chart. I think of it as being akin to a coral reef. A coral reef is a complex ecosystem, and the anchor species in the ecosystem, which is the coral itself, creates a reef onto which various other life forms can attach themselves and engage in complex and symbiotic forms of interaction. Well, in the UN's case, those species are civil society, advocacy groups, social movements, reform-minded governments, researchers, business enterprises. And in the history of this, the incentive structure meant that the coral reef flourished and thrived in the legal apparatus and space of the UN and in the developmental apparatus, but it didn't have the same conditions for thriving around peace and around human rights. And the final piece of this history that I want to flag before we push on to what's happening today is it's also a powerful story about the role of ideas. As awareness around global environmental challenges emerged in the 1970s, the dominant perception of the global environment was that the problem was a so-called tragedy of the commons. And that framing catalyzed efforts to create better collective governance and global rules among nations collectively before individual nations, much like the shepherds in the original story of the tragedy of the commons, would cause irreversible harm given their individual profit-seeking behavior. Well, there's many problems actually with the tragedy of the commons as a story and as a parable, and that's actually not how the original English commons worked. And the reasons it often sustained itself quite well for centuries, and the reasons for decline were different and so on. But as a metaphor and as an idea, it was a very powerful idea, and it stuck. And by the time we get to the 1980s, the additionally powerful idea of sustainable development, propagated by the Brundtland Commission, a previous winner of the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order, I'm pleased to say, for their important work. So we now have the twin pillars of the law and development strategy really reinforced ideationally. And meanwhile, other potentially powerful ideas are not flourishing or are only flourishing later. So the idea that the environment could be a source of violent conflict or a tool for peace has a very long pedigree, but it really has only gained credence and traction in the last decade or so, driven by climate change concerns in particular. Um, I published a book 20 years ago called Environmental Peacemaking with some colleagues of mine, trying to launch and promote the idea that the environment could be a powerful force for peace, bringing actors together in cooperation. And we were met with frank skepticism when we published that book. And it's only in recent years that we see some of those ideas begin to gain traction. And in the same manner, the idea of the environment as a human right was blunted by the Cold War divide around human rights for decades, with the West favoring the idea of human rights as liberal political instruments, protection against the tyrannical state, and the Soviet bloc and third world blocs in the UNs favoring the idea of material socioeconomic rights, and the environment sort of getting caught in between, because it really only works as a human right if it's both a political right and a socioeconomic right at the same time. So it's partly a story about how ideas caused parts of the coral reef to flourish and didn't provide that motive force uh, in other places. So turning to the question that's probably of greater interest, why doesn't this work and what could we do about it? I would offer you three observations. One reason why the grand strategy of better law between nations and better development within them doesn't work is simply globalization. And that law and development strategy, it reflects a sort of a quaint 19th century vision of how international relations and diplomacy function, in which countries exert sovereign control within their borders and coordinate affairs outside and across their borders. I'm not sure the world ever really worked that way, but it certainly bears no resemblance to the 21st century global political economy of global production platforms, of commodity chains like the one on the screen that happens to represent palm oil production, but it could represent the manufacture of computers or the manufacture of t-shirts. Commodity chains that snake in and out and around and across borders, perhaps a dozen times from raw material to ultimate consumer use. Globally integrated capital markets that move money around in a flash. A world that's so interconnected that everything from ideas to pollutants to refugees to new diseases can cross borders in a heartbeat. And there are some big problems with trying to regulate pollution and environmental damage through treaty mechanisms at the international level and legislative mechanisms at the domestic level in that kind of a world. There's just too many hiding spaces beyond the reach of either national laws or international treaty rules. In the book, I use the example of toxics and the attempt to control the toxic waste trade. And it's like squeezing a balloon. You squeeze it in one place and it swells out somewhere else. So governments write a treaty trying to regulate the trade in toxic waste from industrialized north to less developed south. And immediately actors start exploiting the recycling loophole in the treaty. So you could peel the paper off of a disposable lead acid battery, and that battery is no longer considered toxic waste if you recycle the label. It's now considered recycling. So they close the recycling loophole, and then the South-South trade starts to blossom, which the regime never even envisioned trying to regulate. And again, we're squeezing a balloon that keeps swelling out in other spaces as we try to contain it. There's always going to be another place where toxics can be dumped, where polluting industries can be offshored, and landscapes that can be sacrificed to oil and gas production or to mining or to the various appetites of global consumerism. This is where the missing and unused leg of human rights becomes so critical. It becomes important for communities that are on the receiving end of those environmental insults to have the rights-based power to say no. And that's where we need that third leg to be planted firmly on the ground. I'll say a bit more about that when I get to the what to do portion of the talk. The second problem with this law and development strategy is the conflict trap. If you look at the list of countries that are most in need of sustainable development, that are most vulnerable to climate change, that struggle the most to provide clean air and clean water for their citizens. Well, it's the same set of countries that are racked by war and political violence and instability. Of the UN peacekeeping operations that are in the field today, 80% of the soldiers deployed as peacekeepers under the UN flag and wearing the blue helmet are in countries that are in the top 10 list of climate vulnerable nations. It's estimated that something like 1/3 to 1/2 of all the international development assistance that is given gets subsequently blown away by a war or by a disaster. Sustainable development is not possible under those conditions. And if conflict is bad for environmentally sound development, the opposite is also true. Environmental problems can be a threat to the peace. We know from research that conflicts in which natural resources are centrally implicated, they're more protracted, they require larger investments in post-conflict recovery. If they draw a peacekeeping mission from the Security Council, it's going to be more expensive, it's going to be on the ground longer. Under these conditions, when war cripples environmental sustainability, and when environmental sustainability becomes a risk factor for war, we see downward spirals. And the UN, its tools of peacekeeping, of preventive diplomacy, and of conflict resolution are another critical tool, not just for peace, but for environmental governance. And the third reason that the strategy is not thriving is simply that it's run out of political momentum, as I was saying earlier. Now, there's plenty of citizen energy around the planet for environmental protection, for environmental justice, for environmental rights. The problem is that energy has gotten increasingly disconnected from the coral reef that is the United Nations. And it may be that most of that energy will always resonate at the national level. But if it's going to be a force that re-energizes governance to step up to the task, then it's going to have to be internationally connected in ways that the UN and its coral reef can very strongly facilitate. The other place where we may find that political energy is geopolitical. This is a picture of the cabinet of the government of the Maldives, a small a string of atolls, a string of islands in the Indian Ocean, holding a cabinet meeting underwater several years ago. And they did this to symbolize that for them, climate change is an existential threat to their national security. And so there are some 2 million people that live in small islands, primarily in the Pacific, that are perceiving this existential threat all too immediately and all too directly as the effects of climate change increasingly ramp up. If we add to that 1 or 2 million people the number of people who live in low-lying floodplains in nations such as Bangladesh, illustrated here in the map, we are now talking about tens of millions of people, not a few million. And so perhaps if governments are not persuaded by narratives about sustainable economic growth or about environmental justice, perhaps the question of peace and stability can get their attention. Now, we need to be careful with this. There's a danger that in emphasizing those issues, rather than incentivizing cooperation, what you do is incentivize governments to hunker down behind their barricades and try to insulate themselves from these problems, even though that's not really feasible to do. We don't want to militarize or securitize the logic of our environmental responses. The key is not to get them to hunker down, but to find ways to tap that logic of cooperative peace building. This photograph shows mayors from towns in Israel, Palestine, and Jordan jumping together into the Jordan River to make the political statement that it's a dry land, water is scarce, we live on top of the same aquifer, and climate change is about to smack us. We don't have the luxury of being divided by conflict under these circumstances. That longstanding, complex, asymmetrical conflict is one of the world's most difficult and most protracted. And yet even here, we can see the power of this idea of environment and peace linkages. That's something that we need energized in and around and through the United Nations as well. So what do we do? Well, the book talks about many ideas, and I won't try to cover them all in the remaining minutes that we have for this talk. And it's also been a few years since the book was published, and so it's an opportunity to give a bit of an update about which of these ideas have gained traction, and which maybe are still, playing the long game, so to speak. So I'll simply offer a few observations here, and say a little bit about some of the emergent activities that give me some hope about a more engaged and re-energized United Nations and global environmental governance. First, I think it's time to declare a human right to a safe and healthy environment. The United Nations Human Rights Council has been debating this issue for a couple of decades now, and I think it's time to stop the debate and put the full moral force of the UN behind the idea that people have the right to breathable air, clean water, and to participate in the environmental decisions that affect them. This is an idea that is gaining traction around the world. Um, my own state of Maryland in the United States, the local jurisdiction that I live in, has an ongoing campaign for legislation to make the environment a human right in the state of Maryland. In 2017, France passed a very interesting law, the duty of vigilance law, that requires companies to take responsibility for human rights and environmental protection all along the supply chain that they're engaged in, not simply inside the confines and borders of France. That could be a very powerful tool in the context of globalization I was talking earlier. In many countries around the world, Colombia, India, New Zealand, we're seeing the idea that rivers themselves have legal rights, that they have legal personhood, begin to gain traction in court decisions and in legislation. But it's still patchwork and it's still national level developments. It doesn't have the globally integrated character that we need it to have. That's very powerful symbolically, but I want to stress that it's not just a symbolic tool, it's an actual tool. The UN affirming human right to the environment is a tool that allows for more effective naming and shaming of bad actors. We've seen that in the decades since the General Assembly declared a human right to water. And it's also a norm that can be used in domestic legal systems. Not too long ago, there was a very important court case in Botswana affirming the water rights of indigenous communities in that nation. And when the court was looking around for a basis for that decision, it invoked not simply national legislation in Botswana, but that very same General Assembly declaration about the human right to water. Not all legal systems in the world are equally open to that sort of an international normative influence. Certainly in the United States, that's not the case. But in many nations, it is, either because it's just a more transnational legal culture, or in many cases, because it's a relatively young legal order that doesn't have a big body of precedent and case law to draw upon. And so jurists will look around for the basis for a decision where they can find it, including in international normative declarations. So while symbolic, I think this is an extremely important tool in the hands of domestic actors in the legal sphere. A second thing that it's really important to do, and a much more practical application of human rights apparatus of the UN, is to start defending environmental defenders much more seriously. You may be familiar with the Goldman Prize. It's an award. You can think of it as the Nobel Prize for grassroots environmental activists. And the award was created to call attention to their work and to the ideas behind their work and their campaigns for positive change. It was also created, however, to shine a spotlight on them and to protect them, frankly, because the work they do is quite dangerous. Well, in the last 5 years, we have seen two former Goldman Prize winners murdered for their work. And the best data that we have, which is collected by an NGO called Global Witness, they just published their 2019 data. It takes a while to piece this together. It's a bit of a lag. 2019, more environmental activists murdered than any year for which we have, in fact, historical data. And over the last 15 years or so, the number of environmental activists who've been killed or disappeared, it's roughly akin to the number of journalists that have died in the line of duty. We know that it's dangerous to cover the news in a war zone or to do muckraking investigative journalism. Well, it turns out it's dangerous to do environmental activist work as well. And we need the apparatus of the UN human rights system to shine a spotlight on those activities and to remind countries of their responsibilities to defend and protect the rights of people who are engaging in policy processes. A third thing that we need to do, shifting from human rights to the peace and security side of the UN, is we need to find the right role for the UN Security Council on the environment, and particularly on climate change. The Council has been trying to talk about climate change for some 15 years now. It first began debating the question in 2007, and it still really hasn't found its voice. The most recent of those efforts was just 3 weeks ago, and some of you may have seen in the news. It was a session that was chaired by the United Kingdom, and it's interesting to see who showed up at that session. So it was chaired by Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the UK, suggesting that it was a high political moment. That's not usually who chairs a topical debate in the Security Council. It's usually just the permanent representative to the country, maybe a foreign minister if it's an important thing. The head of state, that's a big deal. Joe Biden sent John Kerry, his special climate envoy, to represent the United States in those dialogues. The UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, showed up to give an address, which he doesn't always do for those sorts of events. The British filmmaker David Attenborough was one of the featured speakers, and Nisreen El-Same, who you see portrayed here in the upper right, a youth climate activist who's done a lot coming from Sudan on this question. Well, on the one hand, we see that it's a high political moment. On the other hand, if the keynote speakers are a youth activist and a filmmaker, we're still in the mode of politics of attracting media attention, setting the agenda, calling attention to the wider purpose. And it doesn't really answer the question of what can the Council usefully do besides just talk? The Council, no one is proposing that it be the centerpiece of UN climate efforts. Frankly, it doesn't have the legitimacy to do that. It doesn't have the representativeness as a body. It's not the General Assembly. 5 countries have the veto. Other countries are wary of that. It's never going to be the centerpiece. But it's not useful if it's just a talking shop either. And so the question is, what can be done? Well, I've written about this and I updated that in an article that appeared in Environment magazine at the beginning of last year that people can reference if they're interested in reading the details. But we need the Council to be smarter, to strengthen its own ability to collect and process information and manage early warnings so that it can do its own work in fragile and conflict affected nations in a climate smart manner. We needed to proceed and pay attention to the legitimacy concerns of countries that are wary of the Council by doing that work first and foremost in countries that want the help and that want to be on the Council's agenda. The nations in the Lake Chad Basin are an interesting example of that have had some interesting engagements with the Council around their climate vulnerability. To take one example, Iraq is another country that has been very interested in engaging the Council on this. The Council needs to show leadership, and I think the best way to do that is to challenge countries that want to be on the Council to explain how they would exert leadership and find a role for the Council that is both effective and legitimate, and what that would look like. Japan, Brazil, India, Germany, these are countries that want a permanent seat on an expanded and reformed and plausibly more legitimate Security Council. We don't have that yet, and we're not going to have it in the next few years, but it is coming. And so the time is now to start challenging countries to explain why their bid for a seat should be successful in the face of this pressing global issue. We're starting to see the countries that campaign for a temporary seat on the Council, a 2-year rotating seat that you can get elected to, campaign on climate change. And that's a good trend that should be encouraged because we're starting to get some innovative ideas. We're starting to legitimize an appropriate, limited, but effective Council role. And finally, it would be very valuable if the 5 permanent members of the Council could find a way in their climate initiatives to attach a peace building component to that, even if it were simply for symbolic terms. During the Obama administration, the United States and China agreed on an important collaborative effort. I believe it was in 2016 or so, 15, 16, on climate. And the fact that they did not brand that in part as a stabilizing peace building, security enhancing venture, I think that was a missed opportunity. And if there's another such opportunity, it would be a shame to miss it. And the final suggestion that I'll mention here is it's time for the UN to commit to a responsibility to protect for people who have been rendered vulnerable by climate change and other forms of environmental displacement. And this is a very controversial idea, to be fair. The UN does heroic work for refugees of war and famine. But it's time to recognize that many of those people are fleeing the effects of climate change, of intensifying natural disasters, of the slow violence of damage to local ecosystems and livelihoods. The General Assembly and the United Nations as a whole has recognized that when it comes to genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, that individual nations have a responsibility to protect their citizens from those horrors, but also that the system as a whole, when individual nations are unwilling or unable, also has that responsibility. It's time to extend a similar construct to the victims of environmental change, environmental displacement, and of climate change. This needs to have a proactive, preventive stance primarily, but it also needs to recognize the ethical obligation to provide assistance when that prevention fails us. This is a controversial idea. About a decade ago, there was a cyclone in Myanmar, and the French essentially tried to invoke the responsibility to protect, which the Security Council frequently invokes if it's implementing sanctions or peacekeeping operations, or other sorts of using some of its more commanding powers. The French tried to invoke it because the government of Myanmar, wary and suspicious of international aid organizations, they closed the borders for several days after the cyclone, making it impossible for international relief efforts to function. And the French tried to use the responsibility to protect to force Myanmar to open its borders. And there was very little support for that within the council and within the wider UN system. And so this is a process that's going to, we may need to talk first about a responsibility to prevent and a responsibility to prepare, but those need to be moving in the direction of a responsibility to protect. It's contentious, it's controversial. One of my colleagues told me that I would be persona non grata at the UN for proposing, this sort of a notion, but it's coming, and I think we need to prepare, and we need to be ready, and we need to frame it. So um, some of these ideas are hard. Some of them are controversial. They're reforms that would require a long-term struggle. Others, I'd say we're starting to see some traction. As I said, governments campaigning for a seat on the council are now starting to put climate change in their campaign platforms, and we're getting some creative ideas as a result. That's a good trend that needs to be nurtured and encouraged. Secretary General himself has started to refer to climate justice as a human rights issue, not simply as a global challenge or as an economic issue. And he's also started to shine a spotlight on the problem of violence against environmental defenders, which I applaud. And that's a choice that needs to be nurtured and encouraged and built upon. We're seeing growing recognition around the UN in peace building operations, on the ground recovery operations, that the environment is not just a conflict risk, that it's a peace building tool, and that it can be used to re-engage people in the process of development, in the process of reconciliation, in the process of building trust and recovering from the damage of war or the damage of disaster. Um, and so I guess I would just say in conclusion that, and I'll look forward to your questions and comments, but I would say that the challenges are great. These developments that I'm pointing to are really just the starting point. They're the grass growing up through the cracks in the concrete, but they do show me that change is possible. And so they give me some hope that a re-energized UN can play that leadership role that we very much need from it. And so if this award can call attention to some of these ideas, then I think that's a very powerful force for change in and of itself. I started this talk by saying that I very much believe in the power of ideas, and therefore I appreciate the recognition. But what I value most is the attention that it can draw to the idea that we need a re-energized United Nations in global environmental governance. And so for the opportunity to call attention to those ideas, I'm truly grateful. And I thank you very much. And I look forward to your questions and your comments.
Great. Well, thank you. Let me unmute myself. Thank you very much, Ken. That was a great presentation, a lot to think about there. And I would invite people, I see that questions are now coming in through the Q&A and also in the chat. If people would leave those in the Q&A for the most part, I think that would help. But yeah, thank you very much for what's a really tremendously important issue, and one that's very complex, and one that, again, I've had an interest in for many years, although it's also one that I think it's just difficult to deal with. And given the tragedies and some of the things that you outlined.
And not to interrupt you, Chuck, but I have to say, in the part of the world that you study, we've seen this, right? In the post-Soviet transition, in the post-Soviet world, we see the emergence of environmental issues as high politics, but also some of the challenges around efficacy and so on. And so,
Well, and the first question, I think, really relates to that, and it's important when you think about, say, the newly transition states in the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, certainly the developing world too. This is from Sukaina Taraf, who says, how do you balance preserving or protecting the environment and developing a higher standard of living for humans, particularly when there has been such a high correlation between CO2 emissions and GDP per capita?
it's a great question. It's one of the great questions in this domain. And so thank you very much for the question. The first thing to say, I think, is that there's abundant evidence that sustainability is more of a foundation for economic growth than it is a hindrance to economic growth. I don't want to deny that there are sometimes trade-offs, and that raises equity concerns. We have to ask, whose responsibility is it to manage these problems, given the brutal inequality that we see around the world and the vast discrepancies in standards, in standards of living. But the first point to make is that don't accept the premise that there's an inherent trade-off. There was a really interesting study, again, a study that was catalyzed by the United Nations, called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, that was done around the turn of the millennium. It remains the most detailed, deep dive look at the status of ecosystems of various kinds around the world. Rainforests, coastal zone ecosystems, freshwater ecosystems. That study came to the conclusion that wetlands, bogs, swamps, riverine ecosystems, floodplains, they only cover about 1% of the surface area of the planet, but they're extraordinarily biologically productive. They are critical tools for flood resilience and disaster resilience, because they have an enormous capacity to absorb surging floodwaters and to store water and then to release it during dry conditions. And there's all sorts of ways in which those wetlands, they already are providing us with a foundation for economic growth and development. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment concluded that the value of wetlands, the economic dollar-denominated value of wetlands in their natural state, was greater than anything that we could do by converting that land into other forms of use. So before we accept the idea that there's a trade-off between environmental protection and jobs, or environmental protection and land use, or environmental protection and livelihoods, the first thing we need to do is understand that environmental protection is a critical foundation for all of the above. That said, there certainly are places where we have to look at existing inequalities and say, you know, we may have a common responsibility, but we don't have an equal responsibility. There was a very poignant moment in one of the Security Council hearings when the ambassador from Nigeria was speaking and looked around the room, and I'm going to be paraphrasing here, and basically said, look, sitting around this room are the governments that have the power to do something about this issue. If you look at the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and you look at those 4 or 5 aspirational countries that want to be permanent members of the Council, you're looking at the top 10 emitters of greenhouse gases and contributors, with 1 or 2 exceptions, uh, on the planet. Um, I was once looking at something that came out of China that essentially said this, and this is 25 years ago. I'm showing my age. That essentially said, look, you drove this sport utility vehicle up to the precipice of the chasm, and now you're complaining that it's our weight in the back seat that's going to tip it over the edge. And for just from a basic ethics and equity point of view, that won't do. And so it is important to make space for processes of economic development, um, for conversion of land, for the use of natural resources, and to try to do that in a sustainable manner. I think there's ample opportunity to do it, but I think it starts with a sort of a first do no harm principle of recognizing the economic value that underpins our well-being through those systems. It's a great question, and it's one that we grapple with all the time. You're muted, Chuck.
Thank you. Got a question here from Bill Miller, who has long been associated with the UN, and he'll forgive me. I think he was president of the UN Kentucky Association here for many years. He says, excellent program and congratulations. He's got a couple of questions. I think I'll just ask one for now. Former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and the UN environmental conferences have been credited for promoting discussion of the environmental challenges, especially since UNCED in 1992, even when this discussion was not well received by many of the member states. Do you believe that the world would have as much scientific information and be as focused on the climate crisis today had not the UN consistently promoted the looming climate crisis, even though several member states opposed a collective agreement on what to do to confront climate challenges?
Well, thank you, Bill. It's a great question. And let me just say before I answer it that I do look forward to coming to the University of Louisville, as would normally be the case for a Grawemeyer award recipient. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to we're doing this to do the best that we can. But I'll certainly make it a point to find my way to Louisville. And at that time, I'd love to chat with people such as you and people who are organized around interest in these questions. So I'll certainly look forward to that. I think the quick answer is that agenda setting on climate change has been one of the UN's great achievements if we look at it in historical context. And it really illustrates some of the powers of the organization that we need to be able to use. Let's not forget that the body that is probably most responsible for consolidating our knowledge, not for generating the knowledge, but for consolidating our knowledge, for organizing it, for making it legible to policymakers, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is a UN body that actually won the Nobel Peace Prize. And the original, people talk about the Paris Agreement, but the Paris Agreement is an agreement under the umbrella framework of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was agreed at the Earth Summit in 1992, as Bill knows. And so, and this is one of the main things that the United Nations does. Every important idea that we have about environmental governance, the idea of sustainable development, the idea of common but differentiated responsibility that's embedded in the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and you go on and on and on. They bear the UN stamp in one way or another. The problem, I think, on climate change has not so much been housed in the United Nations as it has been that we had the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We then moved into the Kyoto Protocol, which had binding commitments and timetables for governments to meet. And frankly, governments didn't meet them. They watered them down, they worked around them, they declined entirely. The Bush administration withdrew the United States from the Kyoto Protocol. And so the reason we have the Paris Accord is because of the failure of the Kyoto Protocol. And while I wouldn't want to go forward without the Paris Accord, full stop, it's a weak agreement. It's essentially a voluntary agreement. Countries commit to what they think is reasonable, and they pool their commitments. And that creates a certain form of accountability, but it's a very weak mechanism for attainment and for accountability. And when you tally what those commitments are adding up to, it's not close to enough for the challenge that we face on global climate. So my question becomes, what is going to re-energize politically the family of nations to engage this question the way it was energized to start to do so in the early 1990s, but then consistently lost steam? And I think there are many answers to that question. I mean, I admire what the Sunrise Movement is trying to do here in the United States, for example, and in many places around the world. And I'm not suggesting that the UN is going to be the full source of that energy, but it strikes me that people bearing environmental rights, either as a symbolic norm or as a legal right, um, can provide that energy and can light a fire under their governments to start moving on this more effectively than people that don't bear those rights. And the idea that peace and stability and fragility are implicated in this challenge as well. It's not just an economic question. It's not just an environmental question. Maybe that can help to light a fire under governments as well. And so in that sense, I think it's channeling that power we've always seen around the UN increasingly through these blocked lanes of human rights advocacy and peace advocacy.
Okay, Marilyn Shoren has a good question here. Climate change is a cause for many of the migration or immigration problems seen globally. How much recognition is there at the UN for this? And is there a reason to make this a priority?
Well, there's absolutely a reason to make it priority because the numbers are quite large, and all of the modeling that we have, and I must say, not just modeling, the science of climate change is validated partly by the modeling. It's validated mostly by the fact that the observations that we have in the real world um, are consistent with the modeling. We see the glaciers retreating the way the models predict. I do a lot of work on water, and we see the effects on the ground that the models predict. And so climate science is a grounded empirical science. It's not just an exercise in theoretical modeling the way it's sometimes described. Um, but the numbers of people that are on the move because of intensified natural disasters, I should say disasters. There's nothing natural about the outcome of disaster. Nature gives us the hazard, but it's the social landscape that dictates for whom that will in fact be a hazard. So it's increasingly sort of not cool to say natural disasters. But the climate models tell us, and we're seeing evidence of increasing intensification of extremes, the wildfires, the drought, the flooding, and so on. And so it has to be a priority because the numbers are very large. Couple of caveats to that, though. First thing to keep in mind is sometimes the people who are rendered most vulnerable suffer in place. Uh, they don't have the capacity to migrate. They don't have the capacity to stop scratching out their livelihood for several months. They don't have access to the social networks that might help them move across a border. They don't have access to the funds they may need to pay someone to help them move across the border. And so while the people that we see streaming out of Syria because of war or streaming out of Honduras because of hurricanes, they're highly vulnerable, right? And we have a responsibility, I feel, to those people, and our heart should go out to them. But sometimes the ultra vulnerable suffer in place, and so we need a more comprehensive response than just a response that's oriented toward refugees. The problem is the international machinery for managing refugees is reactive rather than proactive. And it has a very narrow definition of what a refugee is. A refugee is someone who crosses a political border fleeing war or persecution. People who are internally displaced are in a separate category. People who migrate because of economic opportunity or because of economic destitution are in a separate category. And so it's difficult to mobilize the apparatus and machinery um, of managing the refugee crisis until we have an obvious trigger of war or persecution and people are streaming across borders. That activity certainly gets the attention of the major players around the United Nations, and responding to those kinds of crises, or stumbling around failing to respond, as we sometimes, as in the case of Syria, um, is a major part of what crisis management in the UN is all about. I think when it comes to climate change, there's an opportunity to be more preventive. There's an opportunity to be more proactive. There's an opportunity to start to think in terms of early warning, um, that we should be building out the apparatus for now so that we're engaging those questions before they start interlocking with war and disaster and causing large numbers of people to stream across borders the way we're seeing. It's a great question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Number of other questions here. Tricia Gray has a really interesting one. She remarks on the complexity of the debates on climate change and the responses. She asks, how do gender and the environment fit into this complicated puzzle? Can you discuss the significance or examples of gendered approaches to the environment?
Absolutely, and I appreciate the question. And I've actually done some work in partnership with the UN Environment Program. I want to be clear, I don't work for the United Nations in any way, and I don't speak for the United Nations in any way. Maybe I should have said that at the outset. I think it's probably clear. But many years ago, two parts of the UN, two very small and fragile parts of the UN Women, which is a cross-cutting body that tries to be a sort of a bully pulpit to just keep questions around gender on the radar of the larger and wider UN, and the UN Environment Program, which tries to do the same thing on environmental issues. And two very small and fragile entities within the UN. As I'm fond of pointing out, the financial aid budget of my university is larger than the standing budget of the UN Environment Program. Think about that for a moment. But in any case, these two small, fragile, but trying to be megaphones within the UN came together and did a fascinating study around the intersection of conflict, gender, and natural resources. And what that study found was, in the same way that I'm suggesting that environmental governance needs to be conflict sensitive and conflict aware and conflict proactive. The same could be said about gender sensitivity, gender awareness, and gender proactivity. But in this triangular intersection, what they found on the one hand was that war renders women vulnerable in ways that men generally don't experience, and often to a greater extent, whether it's personal insecurity, whether it's loss of livelihood, whether it's the departure of men, whether it's displacement off of the landscape in a primarily agricultural environment, and that natural resources is a centerpiece of this. Access to natural resources in many parts of the world is highly, highly, highly gendered. Again, I do a lot of work on water. Women haul water. Women and girls haul water. If someone has to stay home from school to wait for the water truck, there's a very good chance in many parts of the world it's going to be a young girl. And it can be one of the principal reasons why young girls and young boys don't attend school at the same rate. And so there's an inherent vulnerability that plays out through a gendered division of labor. What war or disaster or conflict do is they dial up that vulnerability and they intensify that vulnerability. And that's a critical insight. But there's another critical insight that comes out of this work, which is we don't want to construct gender simply as vulnerability and only as vulnerability. We also want to look at capacity, and we also want to look at positioning. The very fact that women are charged with managing water as a domestic chore, as a household resource, because that water hasn't become a marketized commodity, and that's when the men tend to come into the picture, means that women are gatekeepers, women are knowledgeable, women have experiential knowledge about managing water supplies, about assessing water quality, about navigating this landscape of vulnerability. And so to me, what it means to be gender sensitive in the context of the specific issues that I'm talking about means both recognizing that vulnerability, but also recognizing those capabilities, which makes women key experts, key knowledge holders, and key participants in dialogue around these issues. And in some settings, key peace builders as well. Thank you for the question.
All right, we've got a number of questions. I'm going to try to combine or get to as many as I can. Please bear with me, folks. Russ Vandenbroek has a great question here, and I want to combine his with one from Roger Payne because they're similar. Russ says, you mentioned the split when the UN was founded between countries favoring liberal rights, generally individual rights, and those favoring economic and collective rights. That split still exists, and the US remains a leading promoter of the primacy of individual rights. How do you suggest we convince fellow Americans that our individualism undermines a healthy environment of the soul world we share? And then Roger's related comment is also on the US. Climate science remains a partisan issue. Do you have any thoughts about climate change as a domestic political issue in the US?
Yeah, great. Hello to my old friend, Roger Payne. I wish we were in person together. I'll see you when I can. Thank you for those questions. First, on the question of human rights, there's a detailed discussion of this in the book. And so if anyone is interested either in the Cold War history of how political rights became a club that the West beat the East over the head with, and socioeconomic rights became a club that the East beat the West over the heads with. And so, we would talk about the Gulag and the Soviets would talk about indigenous people and racism in the United States, and it would just kind of go from there. I think what we have seen in the context of human rights around the UN is a couple of important transitions that help us transcend that split, and that are really powerful tools. And I talk about it in some detail in the book, and I've even got some diagrams in the book about how to create sort of a virtuous cycle of the interplay of political rights and socioeconomic rights around climate change and around water. I won't share the screen again or belabor any of that, but I refer people to the book. But I think one of the things that happened is that historically, human rights at the UN were very treaty-based, and it was about codifying commitments. And governments that didn't sign a treaty, the general frame of reference would be they were not subject to criticism because they hadn't made that commitment. International law, as they say, exists in the prior free will of states, and governments agree to put on the handcuffs and be bound by the commitments that they make. But what we've seen over time is the shift from primarily a legalistic treaty-based system of human rights to a field of practice. We now have the Human Rights Council. We now have the Universal Periodic Review process. We now have a much built out space of special experts and special rapporteurs. We have the bully pulpit of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And as that apparatus has emerged into the space of practice, the fine distinctions between legal, liberal political human rights and socioeconomic rights. As I sometimes say with my students, there's the chicken and there's the egg, and we could debate whether the chicken or the egg came first. But sometimes you're so far down the road, what you've got is chicken salad, and it doesn't really matter about the chicken and the egg so much anymore. And I think that's where we are on this question. And it's pretty clear that they're reinforcing people who don't have the civil and political rights won't be able to hold governments accountable for the meeting of their socioeconomic rights. But the converse is just as important. People who don't have the who don't have that platform, a certain adequate quantity of water, a certain adequate quantity of breathable air, they're not going to be fully capacitated citizens. And so it has to be using the two together to try to create that sort of a virtuous cycle. Um, on climate change in the United States, uh, it's hard, right? I mean, look at the way that we have politicized the wearing of a simple piece of cloth over one's face as a basic courtesy to the people around us. Um, Thomas Friedman had an interesting op-ed in the New York Times in which he said, if we can politicize that, we can politicize anything. We can politicize a sunset, right? We could politicize rainfall if we're going to politicize that. I fear sometimes that climate change has become such a wedge issue and climate advocacy has become so associated with the left that it's difficult to have a bipartisan dialogue on the issue. And sometimes that's where we are, and people have to do what they think is right, and not, the middle of the road is where you get run over, as they say sometimes. However, Americans understand the wildfires in California. Americans understand the drought in the Southwest. The main way that most people are experiencing a changed climate is not walking outside on a Tuesday afternoon and saying, goodness, it's 3 degrees Celsius warmer. The climate has changed. They're experiencing it through wildfires. They're experiencing it through drought. They're experiencing it through extreme weather events. They're experiencing it through catastrophic rainfall. There's a small town that I lived in for 14 years in central Maryland until I recently relocated to Baltimore. And it suffered 2 1 in 1,000 year rainfall events, each of them producing fatal flash flooding in the town center. 2 such rainfall events in 22 months. That sort of recognition of change in the world around you from the bottom up, from the experience outward, that to me is the key to having that conversation. And if people connect that to climate change, if they connect it to disaster preparedness, if they connect it to resiliency, if they connect it to land use strategies, I don't really care what they connect it to as a way to join the conversation. Once they're in the conversation and they're opened to learning, to understanding, to managing risk and uncertainty, then they're going to find their feet in that conversation and we're going to be able to move forward. So for me, it's that lived experience that becomes absolutely central. Thank you, Roger.
All right. Again, I'll combine a couple. One from Jeff DeBelco, who says, given the imperative to make a historically fast transition to a low or no carbon economy, what advice do you have for making that transition as just and peaceful as possible? And Noah Young, similar question, but he's asking about the responsibility of European countries. What responsibility do they have, the ones who benefited from development? What responsibility to the global South countries to have equal access and rights to clean air, clean water, and so forth?
Yeah, well, Jeff DeBelco knows the answer to that question better than I do, and I'm tempted to just tell him to unmute and answer his own question. Jeff and I are longtime collaborators. That book that I alluded to in the in my talk about environmental peacemaking that was published in 2002. Jeff was my co-collaborator on that book, and one of the awards that Chuck so graciously noted in the beginning. Jeff and I actually shared that award for that book. So Jeff could just as easily be sitting right here and talking to you as I am. That's a big question, and there's a lot of dimensions to that question. I'll just pick out one example. And interestingly, I think it connects back to Roger's question about engaging in dialogue across the spectrum. I think we're moving from a world of optimization to a world of risk management. I think the world is growing much more uncertain, broad brush, climatologically uncertain, politically uncertain, financially uncertain. We've had 2 implosions of the economy in a decade now. a decade. And we've seen the oscillation in the political system, and we know what's happening with climate change. Under those circumstances, I think one of the key operating principles becomes flexibility and decentralization and adaptability. If you build a dam, that's a 50, 60-year enterprise. And so the question you ask is, 60 years down the road, are we going to be glad that we built this enormous pile of concrete and transformed land use and water use and energy use and displacement of people and all those other things that comes with such an enormous undertaking? Are we going to be glad? Well, to know whether you're going to be glad, you have to know the price of water for the next 60 years. You have to know the price of the value of land for the next 60 years. You have to know how long that dam is going to be delayed by political controversy by the people who don't wish to be displaced by it. You have to know what the price of energy is going to be. You have to know how bad climate change is going to be. Do we have a better use for the water? Do we need the electricity? In the old days, maybe you could make the case that you more or less knew the answer to those questions, and you could conclude that building this one hunk of concrete and exploiting the economies of scale was the way to go. I don't think we can pull that off anymore. I don't think we can confidently say that we know exactly where and how to place 1,000 megawatts of electricity generating capacity. And if we instead said, what about 10 facilities of 100 megawatts? While none of those might be optimal under the certainty of the old world, we're not putting all our eggs in one basket, and there's wisdom in the old saw. And what about, and then you start thinking provocatively, well, what about 1,000 facilities of 1 megawatt, right? There's a powerful, hard-headed economic argument for decentralization as a strategy of resilience and adaptability once you realize that you don't know what that future is going to look like. And I think one of the keys to climate adaptation is simply to say, what is a flexible energy infrastructure for the 21st century, given all the forms of uncertainty, the economic uncertainty, the political uncertainty? Climate change can kind of get in line among the uncertainties in that case. And you can do the analysis and you can run the numbers, and increasingly you can make the case that that flexible, adaptable, resilient, it lets you change your mind. It lets you delay a decision for a few years. It lets you move things in a way that that big hunk of concrete, that's there for the duration. And so in that sense, I think one of the keys to that rapid adjustment that Jeff is talking about, and we are on the cusp of it, I'm actually fairly confident about that. Wind power is economically competitive with fossil fuels now, and photovoltaic solar is going to be in the coming decade. And there's still regulatory barriers and other sorts of barriers and knowledge barriers and bureaucratic institutional barriers and so on. But markets are pushing against those in a way that actually makes me optimistic about some of those changes.
All right, let me again try to combine several different here because I see a common theme to these. One from Ethan Pelletier, one of my former students now out in Texas, asks about will people feel alienated by international regulations, I would assume through the UN, thrust upon them by an outside organization they might feel doesn't represent their interests or community. And then similar to that, Emma Dabelko says that conflict and environmental issues are deeply interconnected. Nonetheless, you see a conflict between the responsibility to protect and protecting the environment. And let me just elaborate on that and take the moderator's prerogative. I've done some research myself on R2P, and it seems like we've peaked in terms of its appeal. There's a lot of resistance. And I think both what Ethan and Emma are getting at is some of this, again, response that we see, especially among populist groups who are resistant to distant forms of authority, who don't want to listen to it, who are determined to go their own way. And so I think in that context, it seems like, although I'm I think your ideas of applying R2P to environmental issues may be appealing. I'm not sure how politically feasible it is at this particular moment in time. So would you address
Great.
that?
Yeah, terrific question, and I appreciate the question. First, I'll speak just very briefly about the broader question of sort of the perceptions of the UN and the positioning of the UN and the idea of a command from afar. And then I'll speak specifically on the question of R2P. On the broader question, the thing that I have learned in my travels, and I've learned this more from just being a researcher on international environmental issues and being a professor of international relations and having the privilege of visiting, just dozens and dozens of countries over the years and working with people, sometimes in a very localized sort of setting. The thing that I've learned is that the perceptions of the UN vary, VARY. They are very varied around the world. And it's hard to give a one size fits all answer. There are places like in the United States where the UN is used as a sort of a populist cudgel from time to time. The black helicopters and the blue helmets taking away our sovereignty. And most of the rest of the time, it's pretty much irrelevant to American decision making, unless there's something that suddenly needs broad global legitimacy, like the invasion of Iraq. And then you find the US Secretary of State in the chair at the Security Council, briefing the council, and so on and so forth. And governments will use the UN instrumentally like that. That's one of the main political dynamics around it. But among people, there are countries in the world where it's absolutely central. Half of all the children in the world that have been inoculated against disease, that inoculation traces back to the UN one way or another. And people know this. And so there are places in the world where the UN is watched very carefully for what happens and with hope. There are other places where the UN has been involved in messy engagements. I think about the Balkans, for example, where it is absolutely not viewed as a neutral party. There are places where UN peacekeepers have been accused of raping local citizens, and the UN is not viewed as a neutral party. And so you're right to raise that question, absolutely. But I don't think we can generalize the answer to be that people are wary of remote authority. That's one of the dynamics that we see. People sometimes are also hopeful that remote authority is going to be a normative force for change that they wish to see. And sometimes people are sort of tuned out. I agree on R2P. That's one of the reasons why when I listed it among the things that I was talking about, um, that I recognize where it stands in the current political spectrum. I think there are three reasons for that. I think Chuck named the first one, which is there's just there's kind of like a natural life cycle to normative exhortation, and I think we've kind of we're on the downside maybe of something that had some momentum for a while, and I think that's important to recognize. But maybe that means it needs some reinvigoration, right? A second reason for the wariness, I think, is there are people who really believe in the tool and want the tool, and they don't want to see the tool corroded and watered down by having other elements added. Interestingly, historically, this was why many actors in the human rights community were wary of environmental human rights, because they said, we have to, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom from torture. We have to keep that hard, shiny core of human rights. And if human rights becomes everything, then human rights becomes nothing. And I respect that position. And there are people who work with R2P on genocide, war crimes, that have offered that argument to me, and I understand that argument, and I certainly respect it. And I think the third reason is just the current political moment is exceedingly fractious. It is exceedingly divided. I don't know that that's a permanent condition, but it is the moment that we're living through. But my response to that would be, look how long it took to get the original variant of R2P in place. Look at all the hard preparatory work that had to be done by people launching ideas that were considered beyond there was a time when the idea of sustainable development was crazy and controversial, and now it's the conventional wisdom. So, I view my intellectual role as doing the preparatory work, putting the idea in play, pushing the conversation, talking about how a climate R2P might look different than the one that we have. And the letter, it might not be, in the UN parlance, they write the R, they write the numeral 2, and they write the P. Well, it might be R2, even a different letter, because we use a different noun as a way of differentiating. And so that's a political question that'll be sorted out through hard bargaining and dialogue and so on. But the recognition that we need normative tools that unleash practical tools to respond to the coming challenge, the already with us challenge of large numbers of people displaced and dislocated by environmental change. That's why I'm trying to put some energy behind the idea of R2P in that context. Appreciate the question.
Well, thank you. I think that's a good note to end on. I think we've gotten to most of the questions. There may be some that I missed. If so, my apologies, but we are at 2:30, and I think Zoom is going to push us out at this point.
And let me share just my email address on the screen one last time and say, if anybody had something they wanted to be in dialogue about, just shoot me an email and I'll be happy to chat with you.
Great, wonderful. Well, Dr. Ken Conca, thank you so much for a great presentation, for entertaining a large number of questions. I think they're very good questions too. And again, congratulations very much on winning this award. We're very proud to have you as our 2021 winner.
Thank you so much. As I said, I'm honored and humbled to be in the company, and I appreciate the opportunity to share my ideas today and all the great questions from the audience. So thank you very much.